Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Filippo Musca, and I am the Director General of the Siracusa.
أنا المدير العام لمعهد سيراكوسا.
And it's a particular pleasure welcoming all of you at today's webinar, Illicit Flows in the Mediterranean, Vulnerabilities, Asymmetries, and the Limits of the Criminal Justice Responses. A webinar organized by the Siracusa International Institute in the framework of the project Flows, a project coordinated by Transcrime, the Joint Research Center on Transnational Crime of the Università of Cattolica, Sacro, Cuore, a project on the displacement and convergence of illicit flows related to human smuggling and drug trafficking in North Africa and in the Mediterranean Sea. A project financed by PMI Impact, a global grant initiative of Philip Morris International, supporting projects dedicated to fighting illegal trade and related crimes. Before leaving the floor to our distinguished panelists, I would like to briefly introduce the Siracusa Institute. The Siracusa Institute is an Italian non-for-profit foundation funded in 1972, dedicated to education, training, and research in the field of international and comparative criminal justice and human rights. It's recognized by the Italian Presidency of the Republic and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and enjoys cooperation agreements with the Italian Ministry of Justice, High Judicial Council, and the Higher School for the Judiciary. At the international level, the Siracusa Institute enjoys consultative status with United Nations and is part of
استشارية ويقوم كذلك بالعمل.
In 1972, the vision of the Institute has been multi-faced: the protection of human rights through the rule of law and ending impunity for serious crimes affecting peace and security. Our core work includes providing technical assistance to national criminal justice systems, delivering training and education to frontline practitioners and to the next generations of legal scholars, facilitating strategic dialogues across institutions, sectors, and borders. We have worked in the past with a number of UN agencies, UNODC and UNDP, EU Commission and national cooperation agencies, mostly in the MENA region and in Southeastern Europe, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. Throughout our history, the Siracusa International Institute has organized over 700 conferences, trainings, seminars, and educational activities, targeting more than 60,000 jurists from over 170 countries in the world. In our almost 50 years of operations, we have established ourselves as a Mediterranean hub and trusted partner for governments, civil society, and private sectors alike. And the most recent activity concluded by the Institute has been a 30-month project on the fight against illicit trade in Southeastern Europe, a project also funded by PMI Impact. The objective of the project was to strengthen the criminal justice response to illicit trade across Southeastern Europe, and more specifically, identifying the practical challenges and obstacles that affect the criminal justice response to illicit trade at the national and regional level, to building capacity among national law enforcement and criminal justice actors to tackle illicit trade as a cross-sectorial phenomenon, and to consolidate all the lessons learned and best practices that had come to the light in the fight against transnational crime networks in Southeastern Europe. The project produced a very interesting report, Closing the Implementation Gap, which I invite you to download from our website. But today, our focus is on different parts of the Mediterranean and the range of illicit flows, goods, people, money, that in a sense connect Europe, North African, and Middle Eastern countries. These flows have been examined by Transcrime and its partners, And the key findings will be presented in a moment by my colleague, Dr. Alberto Aziani. Before introducing and leaving the floor to our experts, I would like to take a moment to set the scene for today's webinar. 5 contextual points I'd ask our speakers to reflect on in their intervention, and of course, from their own perspective. While there is a general and long-standing consensus about the basic elements of the criminal justice response to organized crime, it is clear that countries within our region and elsewhere take different strategic approaches. They pay varying level of attention to the problem too. But how effective are criminal justice and enforcement-driven responses to organized crime? What alternative approaches have we pushed into the background? There is another important question that I would like to highlight on this note. Do we have the perspective to be able to honestly and objectively evaluate if our enforcement-driven paradigm is doing more harm than good? And if our responses are in turn causing negative or even counterproductive outcomes? Quite apart from strategies and related enforcement practices, most countries face major challenges in terms of skills, experience, and specialized capacity. Often, the basic in terms of professional skills may not be in place. And relatedly, asymmetries in capacity levels are a further obstacle to the effective international cooperation. Cooperation that rests on trust and confidence among counterparts, knowing what they're doing. In the Mediterranean and elsewhere, the response to organized crime and the prioritization of certain illicit flows over others is highly politicized. There is no escaping to it. Irregular migration, for example, has been the dominant length through which European leaders and policymakers have sought to tackle the illicit flows in the region for many years. And a certain level of fixation on people smuggling has also some serious throwbacks. Not only are these laws prone to abuse and regularly misapplied, they arguably take attention away from other, probably even more concerning and higher risk flows. We might also want to ask ourselves, how much escapes the radar of enforcement and intelligence agencies when politics tend to distort perception about the threat landscape? Finally, can enforcement agencies ever be effective if they pursue illicit flows without mapping and targeting criminal structures? The increasingly dispersed crime that are ultimately responsible for such flows. I don't want to take more time from my colleagues, and it's really my pleasure leaving the floor to Dr. Alberto Aziani, senior researcher at Transcrime, and literally the mind and the soul behind the project flows, for a brief introduction to the project and its key findings. Before leaving the floor to Dr. Aziani, I would like to remind the audience that for Arabic interpretation, they must click on the French channel. We are sorry for this bug that we just discovered this morning, but Arabic translation will be provided within the French channel. Dr. Aziani, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Filippo, Dr. Musca, for your very kind introduction. Thank you,
دكتور موسكا، على مداخلاتكم الإسلامية وعلى وضع النقاش اليوم.
This interesting event and collecting together today these very relevant panelists and speakers. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. In the course of the last few years, together with a consortium of scholars and research working in the US, in North Africa, and in Europe, as Dr. Musca introduced, we have been investigating the displacement and convergence of transnational crime in the area of North Africa and the Mediterranean Sea. And trust me, from the day one of the project, I was looking for this workshop in Siracusa, being in the actual Siracusa. Unfortunately, was not possible. We're still happy to be here with you today. And why we focused on displacement and convergence of transnational crime as a core topic of such large project. The point is that on these two topics, there is a sort of discrepancy between what is our perception and the attention we are giving to this topic. So, for example, the convergence between migrant smuggling and transnational crimes, so the trafficking of illicit goods, it's very high in the political and media debate. And at the same time, the displacement, so the change in the nature of transnational crime, is considered very often to be an inevitable outcome of any law enforcement action. While we have this idea in mind, and while at the political, international, and media debate, these two conceptions are very central and we interpret like this, in reality, we have very few or anecdotal evidences about the actual functioning of these two dynamics. So we thought that was very relevant to collect information and start to conduct empirical research to truly understand what's the effect of enforcement action on transnational crimes, and in particular on human smuggling and drug trafficking, which are main concern for the area of interest. So the project focused exactly on this. I will start by providing a very brief conceptualization of displacement to understand then our result and to be able to interpret them. Within the framework of the project, displacement can be understood as the change in the offender behavior, which is designated to overcome the pressure of law enforcement activity. The displacement can take 6 different forms. The most common and easy to understand is the spatial displacement. So if enforcement activity takes place in an area, the criminal may move to a different one to commit the wrong crime. But there are other 5 forms of displacement. For example, temporal. Law enforcement activity are conducted in a specific season. The same crime take place in another season, so to avoid the enforcement. Then we have tactical, meaning a change in the strategy. We have a target, so the victim of the crime itself change. The types of crime itself may change, so we may have a displacement for the trafficking of drug to the trafficking of, for example, gasoline, and we may have also a change in the offender itself. So a group is put under pressure, leave the illicit market, and a new group come in. The point is that obviously, if this dynamic takes place, the enforcement activity might result to be inefficient or even counterproductive. The topic of convergence and the concept of convergence is pretty much developed in parallel with the one of displacement. In this case, the consequence of the enforcement activities is 2 or more crimes joining together in response to the enforcement activity. So for example, again, we have an action in a specific area and the crime that was taking place there moved to another region where other crimes were already taking place. Also in this case, we are focusing on different types of convergence: spatial, temporal, tactical, functional, and offender. And within the framework of the project, in particular, we're focusing on the convergence between human smuggling on one side and different transnational crimes that foresee the trafficking of illicit goods. In particular, we focus on drug, weapons, tobacco products, oil, wildlife, medicine, and also cultural artifacts. And what are the results of this analysis that encompassed like qualitative methods, quantitative methods, network analysis, ethnographic studies, all combined together to produce an actual empirical picture of what's going on in the area of interest. As a first example, I'm providing here the effect of the introduction of a law against, which is criminalizing human smuggling in Egypt in 2016, which is the first law that changed the situation, let's say, in Northern Africa, introducing a discontinuity both in space, so Egypt is the only country having this law, and also in time. Obviously, we didn't have it before its introduction. And as you can see from the graph, the smuggling of migrants after the introduction of the law moved from Egypt, sorry, to the western part of the Mediterranean Sea, so toward Libya and Morocco. And if we look at the different shot in time, at different moment in time, we can see that this result within the first year after the introduction was quite steep, and then the effect decreased. So then we conducted many other different analyses on the displacement crime, and what you observed is that indeed some regulatory reform and some enforcement action have the power or have as a consequence a displacement in transnational crimes, although very often these displacements are partial and temporal. Nonetheless, their effect might be extremely relevant for the safety of the people involved in the activity. And here we have seen, we are displacing, we're showing the consequences of a displacement in modus operandi that took place in the human smuggling after the tightening of enforcement action. And in particular, these changes in the way in which migrant smugglers brought migrants to Europe made the journey more dangerous by making their boats more overcrowded, or by reducing the fuel that the boat themselves had, or by leaving the boats in the sea. So although the spatial displacement, let's say, might be partial, the consequences
هذا التنقل جزئي وذلك بفعل ما قد تكون من عواقب.
As I was saying, on the convergence between human smuggling and other trafficking activities. And the very interesting results that came out is that far from being the norm, the convergence between human smuggling and other trafficking activities is actually quite rare, and we could say episodic. As you can see in the graph, out of 100 cases of migration or human smuggling activity, only 3.4% were occurring together with another form of crime. And in particular, the most common was drugs, so the trafficking of drugs, that was in any case identified only in 1.4% of the cases, while the trafficking of goods like cultural goods or medicine was absolutely not observed. Yet, I mean, even if the convergence is actually quite rare, we were able to understand which are the typology of convergence which are more frequent, in particular the spatial convergence, so two crimes occurring in the same place, the tactical convergence. To give you an example, we observed the use of jet ski to move both migrants and cannabis from Morocco to Spain, and offender convergence. So few groups, we identify few groups that are dealing both in the trafficking of illicit goods and are taking part to human smuggling. Okay, these results and the other we produced in the project then give origin to some policy implication that we thought
يستحسن أن يعتمدوا مقاربات كلية في تحليل الجريمة العابرة.
Human smuggling and transnational crimes in the area of interest. And the first and most obvious is that although these phenomena, the displacement and convergence on crime, are not systemic, they do not occur every time, it's very important both in the design and the evaluation of policies to take into account this possibility. And so to move from a national and local perspective to a broader regional perspective to take into account the effects on other countries. And as Dr. Musca introduced before, this might take place within the framework of international and supranational institutions that are currently available and operate in this field. This is really fundamental for the displacement, but also for the convergence of crime. The problem, the issue of a crime, of a country cannot become the cause of the issue for a second country. At the same time, while more coordination and international approach is needed, we recommend also the adoption of locally specific solution. The entire studies show a very strong heterogeneity of local dynamics, both in the crimes themselves, as well as in their convergence and displacement. So it's very important to be able to differentiate between these dynamics to understand where they're actually taking place, and then design policy that work in the specific environment and in the specific context. And to do this, a number of technical elements and technical instruments might be adopted to understand where and how to intervene. Then we move to the fact that despite, again, all the measures we can take, a very obvious policy solution, but at the same time, one of the most relevant, will be to expand the channels for legal migration into the global north by making available easier and more reliable instruments to move to Europe, to the US, to Australia, will obviously decrease the need of people to rely on criminal schemes to enter this area. And in turn, this will not just reduce the smuggling of migrants, but will also reduce ancillary crimes as counterfeiting and forgery of documents, money laundering, corruption, and other forms of violence. We truly understand, and during the 2 years of the study, we were made aware of this by many stakeholders and many experts, that these are not easy solutions, and these are very, very sensible and delicate topics in our societies, as well as in transit and origin country. So to be effective in these changes, and in particular, to be effective in the change of the migration law, consensus building campaigns have to sustain in parallel the policy reforms. Without them, it will be extremely difficult to change the environment and change the framework within our society. Thanks a lot for your kind attention. I very look into hearing the other panelists and to take part to the debate. Thanks again to the organizer, and see you in a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Alberto, Dr. Aziani, for the introduction on the most important findings of flows, of the project flows. And thank you for highlighting how much displacement on one side may hamper the efficiency and effectiveness
هذا الإجرام الذي يتغير ويتكيف وبالتالي يقلل من فاعلية تدابير مقاومته.
Could amplify the efficiency of criminal operation and at the same time their harmful consequence. And again, I think it's also crucial to highlight every time it's possible the importance of an effective coordination and cooperation among the different actors and stakeholders involved. So it's now with pleasure, I would like to leave the floor to our distinguished panelists. As you will have seen in the agenda, we're going to have two separate panels. The first one will address the recent history of irregular migration and related flows across the Mediterranean region and the current challenges for policymakers and enforcement authorities. Today with us we have Dr. of the Siracusa Institute and Research Fellow of the University of Catania. Dr. Fontana is a Senior Research Fellow at the Department of Political and Social Sciences of the University of Catania, Adjunct Professor of European Politics at the School of International Studies of Trento. Her research focuses on the EU migration and asylum policies in the Mediterranean. She is also currently part of the Horizon 2020 project, Protect the Right to International Protection, led by Bergen University. She's going to be our first speaker today. Please, of course, after the session, we're going to have a question and answer. Please write the questions on our question and answer button, and we will be able to share them with the speakers at that time. I note that we already have a question for Dr. Aziani, which will be, of course, taken care of during the first question and answer time. Dr. Fontana, I'm very pleased to leave you the floor.
Thank you, Filippo. Thank you, Dr. Musca, and good morning, everyone. It is a big pleasure to be here today. Thanks for organizing such a timely webinar on a very crucial topic like the one of illicit flows in the Mediterranean region.
من دواعي سروري أن أتحدث.
Traditionally been at the crossroads of several regular and irregular movements and flows of both people and goods. And I think that especially in the last decade, the governance of the flows, the need to design adequate policies to manage illicit flows have both emerged as compelling issues at the top of the political agenda. And this is especially the case of migration, of migratory flows in the Mediterranean region, which is also my main area of expertise and the area where I've been carrying out research for quite some time now. So in my brief intervention, and I will share my screen in one moment, I would like just to share with you some data about the geography of the flows and the numbers of the flows in the last decade, while focusing also on current trends, as well as I would like to share some reflection on the effectiveness of the policies that have been implemented in that sense. So let me share my screen. And I think at this stage you should be able to see it. So if we try to focus on migratory flows in the Mediterranean by stressing the geography and the main data, we can indeed say that overall in the last 10 years, more than 2 million people strived to enter Europe across the Mediterranean. And this happened mainly through three main geographical routes. The eastern route from Middle East and Syria across Turkey and towards Greece. So this is a route that was also a very crucial one, especially in 2015, with a peak of 1 million people arriving irregularly to the European Union. The central one from Libya and Tunisia towards Italy, and the western one from Morocco to Spain. And more recently, we also know that the Balkan route has emerged as a very crucial one. Almost 30,000 people crossed the borders irregularly during last year. So what about now? Most of people were thinking that COVID-19 would have affected the flows in terms of
البعض اعتقد أن فيروس.
Actually, if we look at the data, we can say that COVID-19 has not affected the flows in terms of a reduction of numbers. So here you can see in the slides some of the numbers in terms of arrivals of people to Italy and Spain in 2019, so before COVID, and in 2020, so during COVID. So as you can see, if we compare the data, the number of people arriving in 2020 is higher than the number of people arriving in 2019. And this trend is expected to continue and even to rise in 2021. So as you can see in the period January-April of this year, we are already recording a higher number of people arriving to the EU if compared to the same period of 2020. So here you can see in the chart the distribution of arrivals across time in the past 10 years. As you can see, in 2015, we have this peak of more than 1 million people arriving irregularly to the European Union. And this is also why 2015 was normally labeled as the year of the famous migration crisis. Anyway, I will say that 2015 was not the real watershed year, but I will say that 2011 was instead. Because if you look at the graph, you can see that in 2011, we have an immediate surge and a 70% increase if compared with 2010. And in that regard, we can say that the Arab uprisings were a major game changer for two different reasons. First of all, because in the short term, the Arab uprisings and the political turmoil provoked by the protest added to the already existing structural, economic, and demographic causes for migration. And so in the short
على عوامل
immediate outflows towards the European Union. In the longer term, instead, at some point, it became clear that the uprisings had really shaken the region profoundly. And so at some point, the initial migratory waves that were intended to be just temporary ones actually turned into a stable migratory tide due to authoritarian backlash, to economic crisis, and above all, to the very convoluted situation of civil war in Libya and Syria. So the Arab uprisings really were a major game changer in the sense of exposing also the high level of interdependence between countries of origin, of transit, and of destination. So against this background, what kind of policies were implemented? I think that if we look at the policies of the European Union, we can somehow sketch three main clusters. Policies beyond the borders of the member states and of the EU in the sense of cooperation with third countries of origin and transit. And I'm thinking about, of course, the EU-Turkey agreement, about the Italian-Libya Memorandum of Understanding. Then we have policies at the EU border in the sense of border controls, patrolling of frontiers, anti-smuggling policies, of course, search and rescue operations, and the implementation of the famous hotspot approach at the external borders of the EU, mainly in Italy and Greece, with the goal to prevent the so-called secondary movements. So just to make sure that all the people that arrive irregularly at the Italian or Greek border can be properly fingerprinted and recorded into the Eurodac system. And so in order to prevent the secondary irregular movements from the external borders towards other member states. And finally, policies inside the EU borders. I would say that from 2014 up to May 2021, Schengen was suspended and temporary controls were introduced 70 times, and they were justified on the ground to prevent secondary movements. So looking at all these kind of enforcement policies, what kind of effectiveness? So before, in the previous presentation, the colleague Alberto Aziani was raising very, very interesting points, including the one related to the fact that enforcement policies can sometimes make the journey of the people on the move even more dangerous, and they can also somehow prompt smugglers to change their modus operandi. And I totally endorse that kind of conclusion, which is also coherent with the result of my own research, in the sense that we can indeed sketch a sort of interplay between criminal practices and policy choices. Human smugglers are actors, they are agents, they have their own goals, their own strategies. And so indeed, what can be observed is that in many cases, there is a change of routes, for instance, from the easiest one to more covert and dangerous ones. There is a change also in the kind of vessels adopted. For instance, many reports stressed that one of the consequences of the UNAFOR-MED operation was to push smugglers to switch vessels and to replace robust wood boats with very inexpensive inflatable dinghies, just to reduce losses in the case of a seizure of their vessels. Or at the same time, one unintended consequence that was stressed was also the fact that in order to avoid the risk of being apprehended, many groups started to replace professional smugglers just with random, inexperienced migrants, so that in the case of an interception by UNAFOR-MED, the fellow of the group could not be arrested. And another point that I would like to stress, and that is also in line with what Dr. Aziani was suggesting in the last slide, is related to the fact that closing do not stop people from fleeing. And in that regard, I would like to show you this chart. Here you can see a comparison of the number of irregular arrivals across the three main routes that I was mentioning before. So we have the eastern route, the central one, and the western one. The light blue line is the moment when the EU-Turkey deal was concluded. The green one is the moment when the EU, but it would be more correct to say the Italy-Libya deal was concluded. As you can see, on the eastern route, after the EU-Turkey deal, of course, the numbers really dropped and there was an immediate decrease. But they started increasing on the central route. Then we have the deal with Libya, and the numbers on the central routes starts to decrease, but there is a surge on the western route. So just let me be clearer. What I'm saying is not that these routes are covariating in an automatic way, of course not. But what I'm trying to say is that as an IOM official told during an interview in Cyprus, migration is like water. You cannot stop it. You can just deviate its course. So if we close one route, you can make sure that if there are no other alternatives, legal channels open, people will continue to try to find their way to Europe, and the smuggling industry will continue to exist. Not to mention potential unintended consequences, even in terms of humanitarian consequences. I think it is really interesting to see that in the last years, the ratio arrivals versus death has increased a lot. So we moved from 2.5% of people dying on the total of those arriving to Europe up to 8%. So I think that the biggest challenge that we are facing here is related to the fact that we have a profound tension between the short-term character of policies and the long-term nature of the migratory phenomenon. If I look at policymakers in the member states in the European Union, I think that I would say that this narrative of migration as a temporary phenomenon has become the everyday politics of migration. There is this prevailing idea that migration crises in the Mediterranean region are just a spatio-temporally limited phenomenon. So just things that can be dealt with, urgency measures, temporary measures, just to deal from time to time with the immediate flows of people that can arrive. But the thing is that migration and asylum are not temporary phenomena. They are here to stay as long as conflicts, wars, poverty, climate change continue to exist. So there is this sort of gap that somehow narrow the potential of policy responses, in the sense that we have policy responses with a short-term character based on the idea that we have to just restore the status quo. We have just to prevent the flows, rather than trying to think of potential measures to address the demand of mobility, the long-term demand of mobility. So I think that we can somehow borrow some word from maritime metaphors, in the sense that for many policymakers, migration is a sort of waves. So we have just a moment of migration upstream that are related to an exogenous event. But I would rather say that migration is not a wave. We are facing in the Mediterranean a permanent tide that depends on structural factors. So my conclusion is that if we do not try to include legal channels of mobility, migration crises in the Mediterranean region are set to travel back to the future. We are set to have a sort of vicious cycle. The more we close the borders, the more we will have dangerous irregular migration, the more we will have disorder at the borders, which will in turn result again into more border closures, and the cycle will start back again. So if we do not change this gap between the short-term character of policies and the long-term natural migratory phenomena, and if we do not include legal channels of mobility, all these migration crises are set to be repeated over time from one border to another and from one crisis to the next. And I think I'll stop here. And I really look forward to the debate at that point.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fontana, if you could please close the sharing of the video. Thank you very much for your incredibly interesting and especially timely presentation. And I liked a lot one of the last concepts you shared, the idea that policymakers should probably reflect more on addressing the problem from its roots, rather than just focusing on preventing that problem to happen. So once again, thank you very much. And I'm sure we're going to have a number of questions from the floor. It's now my pleasure to introduce the second speaker of the first session, Ms. Patrícia Silveira, Head of Unit Strategy and External Relations at Europol. Mr. Silveira is a senior police officer responsible for strategy and coordination in the areas of criminal intelligence and cooperation in the financial information units, and in the criminal investigation areas of economic and financial criminality and money laundering, trafficking in persons, and serious organized violent crime. She's also a trainer in operational training on criminal matters and law. Ms. Silveira, I'm very honored to leave you the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank Director Filippo Musca for inviting you.
Filippo Musca
Europol is the European Union's law enforcement agency, and it assists the member states in the fight against serious organized crime and terrorism since 1999. With more than 20 years of experience, Europol is now very well embedded in the EU security architecture, and it has developed into the EU Criminal Information Hub. Information exchange between Europol and its partners has very much grown in terms of exponentially over this period, and also with the member states and its partners that entrust Europol with millions of data on live investigation in a number of criminal areas. On a daily basis, our agency supports law enforcement operations, providing criminal intelligence analysis in a range of services to national enabling authorities. In my intervention, I will address the topic of illicit trafficking across the Mediterranean, not only on migrants, but also touching upon drugs and weapons, as well as our role, Europol's role in tackling these crimes. I will also stress the need to enhance the cooperation with the authorities from the Middle East and the North African countries to combat serious and organized crime and terrorism, and describe what the agency has already done to achieve this result. So to begin with, I would like to tackle briefly the logistics of crime, since international mobility is a defining character of transnational organized crime. So during the pandemic, we have seen that the shipping of orders that were placed online and that were fulfilled by post and parcel services, we've seen it accelerated, especially for illicit drugs, counterfeit currency, stolen and fraudulent documents. I would like to share with you some figures about volumes and trends, and also offer you a few considerations about illicit trafficking. As far as drugs trafficking is concerned, EU drugs markets are supplied by sophisticated criminal networks engaging in both wholesale trafficking, but also mid-level or retail distribution. The trade in the four main commodity groups of illegal drugs that dominate European drugs markets. So we have cannabis, cocaine, heroin, and synthetic drugs, exploit violence, corruption, document fraud, encryption, and all the opportunities that are offered by the online environment. Europe's participation, just to give you an overview, in counter drug trafficking operations has been significantly increasing. We can see that we have participated in 336 operations in 2020 against 139 in 2019, which is plus 143%. And already this year in the first quarter, we have participated in 98 operations. In the first months of 2021, more than 25 tons of cocaine and 1.5 tons of heroin were seized as a direct outcome of Europol's intelligence. In what relates to firearms trafficking, the use and the availability of firearms is rather high. Distribution is mainly linked to individual networks, contributing to shape a scattered landscape of firearms distribution. Besides producing 151 operational products in the first quarter of 2021, Europol analysis project Weapons and Explosives supported 12 priority cases and 18 potential cases. In 2020, 17 impact operational actions in the field of firearms trafficking saw the participation of Europol. What is worth highlighting in this is that Europol's input on the detection of illicit flows of drugs and weapons trafficking has been significantly reinforced by recent operations supported by Europol against platforms providing encrypted communication. One of the most recent ones is the one that was known as Operation Emma Encrochat. The operational activities in this case, it started as an investigation of 2 member states that requested the support of Europol, and it was based on a large amount of data that consisted of more than 120 million individual messages that included a wide variety of files. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this operation, the main investigation gave room to more than 1,500 spin-off investigations, which are currently being conducted in more than 30 countries, 26 of those EU member states. It also led to the detection and the prevention of more than 100 planned murders and other threats to life, as well as the prevention and counteract of hundreds of other serious crimes. It also led to the arrest so far of more than 1,800 suspects and the seizure of tens of tons of drugs, hundreds of weapons, and substantial criminal proceeds, of which more than 138 million in cash alone. As far as migrant smuggling and trafficking of human beings are concerned, and also despite the pandemic, in 2021, along the main routes that go through the Mediterranean,
خلال المسارات الأساسية التي تعبر في المتوسط
871 people have been smuggled or trafficked into Europe either by
1000 شخص من خلال البر أو
of 2021, Europol's European Migrant Smuggling Center, which we call EMSC, through its analysis projects, Migrant Smuggling and Phoenix, supported already 82 priority cases in the field of migrant smuggling and 9 priority cases in the field of trafficking in human beings. In this regard, I would like to provide you 2 recent operational examples that we supported towards countering migrant smuggling and also human trafficking. On 29th of March this year, Europol supported the Spanish National Police, Policía Nacional, in dismantling an organized crime group involved in migrant smuggling from Morocco to Spain through the Strait of Gibraltar. The network, the criminal network, was composed by Spanish and Moroccan nationals, and the suspects smuggled Moroccan nationals through the Strait of Gibraltar in life-threatening conditions on different vessels, some of them stolen. Evidence suggests that there are links between the network and a deadly shipwreck, which took 4 lives in February. We had simultaneous police actions. There were 150 police officers deployed, and in the result, we supported 6 house searches, 20 suspects arrested, and we had suspects that were charged with migrant smuggling and 4 murders related to the crossing and those deaths. Also the seizure of 3 boats.
هذه الوفيات كما أننا قمنا
fiberglass boats, jerry cans, and big tanks of fuel, more than 7,000 liters, 5 weapons, mobile devices. And in this case, Europol facilitated all the exchange of information and also the operational coordination and the analytical support on the spot. I also bring you another case just to give you another example of the range of the operations also that we support also in this area. Another one was that we supported was led by the French police, the French border police, judicial police, the Romanian police, and the Moldovan police. And Eurojust and Europol supported this operation that led to the dismantling of an organized crime group that was involved in migrant smuggling, human trafficking, and human trafficking in this case for labor exploitation. It was also document fraud, social benefit fraud, and money laundering. It was organized by a national Romanian living in France that smuggled Moldovans. It was a very lucrative network, criminal network, and the legal profits were estimated in 14 million euros. So we also supported the Joint Action Day and simultaneous actions in France, Romania, Moldova, searches in 51 locations, 38 arrests, and the seizure of 19 vehicles, 2 jet skis, weapons, telephones, 100,000 in cash, and also the freezing of 11 bank accounts. The purpose to show you this is the wide amount of profit that derives from this type of criminal networks, and also the relation as Mr. Alberto said before, between several types of crime. In view of the criminal threats related to the EU neighborhood in the external relations strategy of Europol, we have a strong focus on Western Balkan and the Middle East and Northern African region, as you just noticed by the 2 cases that I presented. While we have concluded cooperation agreements with all Western Balkan countries, we still have a gap in what respects Northern African countries and Middle East. And we plan to focus on deepen that cooperation, starting with Tunisia and Morocco. We need to acknowledge and we need to understand that the new threats and we need to develop our capabilities to anticipate them or to adapt our response to them. It is essential to implement a strategy of dialogue and cooperation in order to enhance the information exchange and deepen the operational cooperation. So Europol has its external strategy, external relations strategy that has entered into force in the beginning of this year. It's 2021 to 2024. And we have set a plan to bridge the relationship gaps between the EU and the law enforcement institutions in the Mediterranean Sea. I would like to refer to a conference that was organized by the Portuguese president's EU MENA conference, where we introduced, the executive director of Europol introduced and presented a concept that is related to the establishment of dedicated policing partnerships with individual MENA countries. The policing partnerships would provide an overarching framework for the existing joint activities between Europol and individual MENA countries through a more structured dialogue with law enforcement counterparts. It will help to identify common interests and topics and possible future cooperation. Each one would be tailored to a specific country and its needs and the common interests. I would also like to briefly mention Europol's past and present involvement with the two EU common security and defense policy missions, namely UNAVFOR-Med Operation Irini and UBAM Libya.
مهمة في ليبيا.
Europol signed a working arrangement in December 2018 with UNAVFOR-Med Operation Sophia, which was later extended to the successor, Operation Irini. And since 2016, Operation Sophia and then Irini have deployed a liaison officer to Europol's Migrant Smuggling Center. The cooperation takes place on a daily basis through the Information Clearinghouse, which is a fusion-like concept embedded in Europol, and which supports the detection, the selection of high-value targets, and the establishment of operational task forces to ensure the disruption of migrant smuggling networks. Frontex also participates in this network. Until the end of 2018, there was an expert from the European Migrant Smuggling Center of Europol that was seconded to UBAM Libya. Even though currently we do not cooperate with UBAM Libya, but having in mind recent positive developments in the country, we believe that it is essential to start building the relationships with relevant authorities, and we would see UBAM Libya as an important facilitator for such initial contacts. To conclude, I would like to briefly mention that Europol is deploying staff, guest officers, to the EU external borders in Cyprus, Italy, and Greece to implement the secondary security checks. Europol is currently foreseeing the development of a new operational plan for the security checks, which would have a more flexible approach to deploy guest officers in other landings where it would be required, such as Puglia, Calabria, or Sardinia. This brings me to the end of the intervention. Thank you very much, and apologies for overstaying 2 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Silveira. You were perfectly on time, actually.
شكرا جزيلا، لقد احترمت الوقت المخصص لك وأشكرك.
Interesting insights from the most recent successful operations of Europol in the region. It's clear how much the greater Mediterranean region is becoming a priority every day more for Europol, and it's also very important to see how Europol is opening to the MENA region and looking at the number of potential stakeholders, including UBAM. And I'm very happy that Mr. Romano, who is an officer from UBAM, will take the floor in the next session. So I would like now to open the floor for comments and questions. We already have a couple, and of course I would like to invite Dr. Aziani to feel free to also participate as a speaker. As a matter of fact, there was a question for Mr. Aziani from our participants. And the question is relating human trafficking as a converged crime in the analysis the project flows made, because it wasn't directly mentioned in the presentation. So Dr. Aziani, if you want to elaborate on this, please, the floor is yours.
Sure, and thank you, Ms. Sarah Blacher, for your question. Indeed, it's true. In my presentation, I was not referring to as in the project, we decided not to focus on this form of convergence. We decided to put our attention on the convergence between the smuggling of migrants and the trafficking of illicit goods. The reason for this choice is not that we consider human smuggling not possibly to converge with human trafficking. On the contrary, in these 2 years of the project, we identified different cases and different situations in which human smuggling and human trafficking may converge, or what the scholars label as a failure of the smuggling. So a migration and assisted migration experience that then became a trafficking experience. So the migrants end up in being victimized and exploited by the smuggler that at that point becomes trafficker. So we are aware that this is a dynamic that actually takes place in the area of interest, but at the same time, since there is not so much debate on this, it's quite well known that it happens, we decided to focus our attention on the human smuggling and the trafficking of illicit goods. And while I'm saying that there is no much debate on the fact that these dynamics, so the convergence between human smuggling and human trafficking as form of convergence, I don't want to mean that we know everything about it, all the dynamics that lead to this, but for sure is a topic that received more attention.
لكن هذا موضوع نحن نعرف أنه يثير اهتمام كبير ويتم في إطاره تجميع معلومات أو بغية فهم
of trafficking activities that were mentioned also in the presentation by Patrícia Silveira. I don't know if the other two panelists want to give their comment on this specific aspect, not on the fact that we didn't include in the project, but maybe on the nature of this form of convergence.
I think that Dr. Fontana had a sort of question comment on this.
Yeah, actually, thank you, Filippo. I have a question for Dr. Aziani, not really related to this convergence between human smuggling and human trafficking, which actually, and I have to say, I endorse what Dr. Aziani was saying, because indeed the two phenomena are pretty much entangled. And so in many cases, what has been recorded is that what starts as a phenomenon of human smuggling rapidly turned into a phenomenon of human trafficking. But my question is related to what I found extremely interesting in the presentation. So the introduction of this law in Egypt in 2016. So this law in order to fight against smuggling. So I would like to ask whether you observed such a thing only in the case of Egypt and also in other countries. And above all, when you were making this comparison with the two different charts, so the effect before, so what was the situation before and then the effect after the introduction, are you considering as an after just the mere fact that the law was approved, or also the full implementation of the law? Was it then really fully implemented and applied, or it was just, let's say, on the paper? So that's my point, and I would like to ask about that. Thank you.
Thank you for your interest and for your questions. I will start from answering that no. Today in my presentation, I decided to give this exemplification of the law in Egypt, but we focused also on, for example, the change in the policies that took place in Italy under the Ministry of Minniti, to give an example, or we focus also on target intervention on specific municipalities and ports in the coast of Libya. And we also considered the case you also mentioned in your presentation about the EU-Turkey deal. So the choice of presenting the case of Egypt was mainly related to the fact that we can graphically observe this shift, and I just think it works in a video presentation. The technicality of the analysis is quite complex, as you all may understand. There are different factors and many different confounding factors that intervene in the course of few weeks, in the course of few months, and even more during the years. So it's not easy to disentangle the effect of the law itself from the change in perspective and the change in the entire context. To try to take into account this, we proceed into direction. From a certain point of view, we worked on different time frames, assuming that the closer you stay to the introduction and the implementation of the law, the lesser are the contextual effect that may impact the shift, while the longer you go, the more able you are to observe the larger trends. You can rely on larger amount of data, but obviously you may have the impact of more confounding factors. And we were quite reassured of our result because taking different time period, the statistical difference between what we labeled as Egyptian route, considering the area of Egypt and the sea pertaining to the country in comparison to the other routes, was statistically significant. And as a second thing, we tried to take into account the overall trends in the number of migrants that obviously influence also the departure from Egypt by reasoning in terms of share of total departure instead of counts of migrants that leave a single country. Because as the panelist Iole Fontana showed, we have trends and fluctuation in the numbers of departures. So it's not being stable is impossible to compare just a pre-post scenario without taking into account these elements. And for what concerned the last part of your question, we consider it as a pre-post point, cutting point, the adoption of the law. But several experts and cases indicates that very soon after the introduction of the law, there was a shift in the attitude of Egyptian law enforcement toward the smuggling. So very important arrests and seizures have been recorded in the very first weeks after the adoption. And also moving, let's say, the cutting point between the pre and post scenario, let's say our results were not significantly affected. But obviously, this is a point that should be taken into consideration. And one of the things that we also observe we have also observed in this entire project is the fact that obviously the implementation and the reform in the real life, not just this Egyptian one, but other, may change. I mean, they remain the same on paper, but in the course of few years or even months, how the enforcement agencies and how the criminals themselves put in place and react to the reform may change, and this obviously increase even more the complexity of reasoning on these dynamics. Thank you again for your very interesting question.
Thank you, Dr. Aziani. We have another question from the floor.
هناك سؤال من القاعة.
It's a question on the impact of the
هو سؤال يتعلق بتأثير جائحة كوفيد-19
flows in the Mediterranean, and generally speaking on the criminal justice approach. I think Dr. Fontana already mentioned briefly that COVID, surprisingly from one side, didn't affect the numbers. But maybe the speakers would like to elaborate a little more on this.
Yes, thank you, Filippo, and many thanks to the audience and especially to these participants for asking this question. So also because it provides me the chance to elaborate a bit more on. There are three main things that we can say as to what regards the impact of the pandemic on the flows across the Mediterranean. So the first thing is that, as I was mentioning in my presentation, COVID did not impact the flows in terms of a reduction of numbers of people trying to get to the European Union irregularly. If we observed a reduction, this was just a very short-term one during the month of the lockdown, for instance, in Italy. So if we look at the data of March, April 2020, in that case, it is true that there was a reduction, but it was just a very temporary one. So already from May 2020, and with summer coming, the numbers started to increase again, as I have shown in the presentation. The second thing that we can say is that according to many experts and to some reports, COVID has somehow added a new driver of migration. It represents a sort of multiplier of already existing migration drivers. Because if normally people migrate in the Mediterranean because of poverty, because of economic reasons, or in order to escape a situation of political instability and war, COVID-19 added a further layer of complexity in that regard, so somehow multiplying already existing causes. And the third thing that we can say is that if we look at the composition of arrivals, and I'm talking about the case of Italy in particular, what we have seen was a reduction in the number of people departing from Tunisia. By contrast, the number of people departing from Libya didn't record a decrease at all. And according to some experts, the reason is related to the fact that people departing from Tunisia generally do so by the means of human smuggling services provided by small groups, where there is definitely much more flexibility in order to react and adapt to external events such as the pandemic. In the case of Libya, instead, it seems that the business model is somehow really independent from this kind of external shocks, such as the one of the pandemic. So if we look at the people departing from Libya, apparently there was no reduction. So it did not affect the normal running of the business model in that case. And I will leave the part on the impact of criminal justice systems, so the second part of the question, to the other speaker, as this is not directly my field of expertise.
Thank you, Dr. Fontana. Of course, also the speakers of the session will be able to respond to this question during the next question and answer. Unless Ms. Silveira wanted to add something, I will then close this session. Okay, so actually we received other questions which I would like though to keep for next question and answer session, because it was a question more generally speaking on the responses of the criminal justice system as a whole, especially focusing on investigation, prosecutions, and trial. And that's why I would like also our other speakers to be involved. I also see that there is a comment in the chat from Justice Majid, and of course I think that we can agree with your comments, and probably we can also address your comments in the next question and answer session. So I would like for the moment to thank our first two speakers. I understand that Dr. Fontana will have to leave. So thank you very much for your kind intervention and very interesting intervention. And of course, also thank to Ms. Silveira and thank to Europol of having accepted to participate to this webinar. So it's now also my pleasure to introduce, almost on time, the second addressing risk of crime, displacement and convergence through rule of law assistance and deeper international cooperation. And we have two speakers also for this session. The first speaker is Mr. Andrea Romano, Strategic Organized Crime Advisor at the Law Enforcement Unit at the EU Border Assistance Mission in Libya. Mr. Romano is an Italian Inspector Superior of the State Police, and he has 35 years of service, 11 of those in international missions within EU and UN, with a specific focus on organized crime, specifically in Kosovo and Libya. His work has led to a number of successful operations, concluded with several arrests of smugglers of migrants. Mr. Romano, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and it's a very interesting.
سيد فيليبو إن أتشرف بالحضور. هذا الموضوع شيق للغاية. هل تسمعونني؟
Kind of question or suggestion that we have to monitor the border, and we have to make a common policy on the justice and law enforcement. I will go deeper in this, and just because the most of the audience already said enough about the translational organized crime, I will focus more on the victim point of view. How the victim will see this smuggling, not how we will see this translational smuggling. Let me start just saying that border monitoring and border closure is impossible. We are speaking about huge sides of territory. When we speak just about Libya, we are speaking that is wide 1,300 kilometers and its height 1,365. It's impossible to monitor all those areas because there are no fences and there are also almost no population at all, especially in the south. You have just the desert or empty territory. The few inhabitants that are living there are in 2-3 villages. If you are not going from that side, you can drive for 100 kilometers without seeing anyone. Then it's really easy to cross the border because you don't even realize that it's a border. The easier thing is just to understand where they are going and to check the people, the migrants over there. Another thing that I want to remark is that this crime, smuggling of migrants, or that is usually changing also in trafficking of migrants, I agree on that, is not seen as a crime. The most of the people see that as an opportunity to have a better life. And it's more or less accepted also by the people that are not involved in this kind of crime, because they see that like an opportunity for a better life. And even if they see that, they are not reporting this kind of crime. And then also about the coordination. I see that for the most of the time, there is no coordination almost at all between the different law enforcement police, between several countries, and sometimes even inside the same country. It's not just about having trust. Sometimes it's also about not having the right devices. The most of these countries are not having a proper database or proper Wi-Fi or proper lane wire connecting all the main police stations. Then they are still working with fax and writing reports. And you can understand that by doing this, it's really difficult. It is the main thing that can make us understand about a translational organized crime. Also, this point of view, transnational organized crime is just our overview of seeing that. But from the local point and the local criminal smuggler, they see at the very local level. I mean, they live in one village. I had direct experience on this. And they just have to smuggle the migrant from their village to the next border. What's going on later on, it's not up to them. They will give to the other group, and the other group will take care, of course, for money, to go ahead in the next step. What I mean is that they don't have like a transnational organized network for smuggling migrants. They have a very local one. It's like a multi-cell structure. Each cell is taking care of this area of responsibility. That is usually their village. Here there are several tribes and villages that are usually having their power on that area. They are responsible for that area. If you go through that area, you have to pay them, and they will take care to go ahead in the next part of the territory. And connecting to what Mrs. Fontana said about the change of flow from Egypt, as just they change the rule and they approve this new law. We see that they changed the route from Egypt to Algeria.
احيانا القوانين تتغير من مصر الى الجزائر.
They have always multi-choices in smuggling the migrants. And then instead of contacting the one that is working on the north, they will contact the one that is working on the west. And they will go from that side. And from that side ahead, instead of north, west, or east, it depends. And they are very well connected, and they have an excellent flow of information about this. I was surprised in Kosovo. I had the executive power there, and then I made investigation and arrest. And we were intercepting the telephone of some of these migrant smugglers. We knew that they changed the law on the migrants from their interception. They knew before us that they made some changing, and according to that changing, they change also the flow of the migrants, following the easiest way and choosing the right countries to have less risk. And this brings me also to another question. I know that I'm the one that is supposed to receive question, but I will do that.
أنا أعرف أن هناك وقت لإصغاء الأسئلة لكنني سأرد على بعضها.
You have to put in the shoes of the migrants and the migrant smuggler. If I'm dealing with this business that is giving me a lot of money, is not even considered a crime. People are accepting that, and then I'm not risking anything. Why I have to change this? Even the migrants, it's easier for them to give the documents, give the money, and wait that they will receive a phone call to say, tomorrow be there, and at 8, and we will go ahead, full stop. They will decide how and when. It's really easy for them. And also, as it was already said, there is not even written in the most of the penal code that smuggling of migrants or trafficking of migrants is a crime. And to make like a transnational organized crime, you should coordinate all the different penal code and at least find something common between them to be considered always a crime. Otherwise, every time that is crossing a country in which is not considered is like a reset to 0, and it will start from the next country. A live detention center. Yeah, I also want to give like a solution in this because it's consider like water this flow because you cannot stop because the water find always another way to go.
لا يمكننا أن نغير مجال.
Possible to close the pipe if they still have this kind of business with no risk and no alternative. We have to give the alternative. The alternative could be to make them earn money because for them is a job. We have to give a different job or a different way to earn money in an easier way. Because if they are so used to do this, they are not that keen in changing this business that is very remunerative and low risk. This will be more up to NGOs, I guess, to find something, or to UN to have a huge project.
المناسبة للمناطق أو الأمم المتحدة أن تعد مشروعا واسعا.
Should be some jobs that are strictly connected to that territory, what the territory can give. We cannot say in advance something that is really general for everybody. But, you know, also to understand all this phenomenon, we have to map and to have the information. That is also the greatest challenge ever, at least in Libya and in some neighboring country, because it's not easy to have the information from the right people. Usually you have something that is reported by an indirect source. And in this way, you cannot be sure 100% of what you are receiving. You should be directly on the spot. But at the moment now, here is impossible because Libya is an high-risk area and we cannot go around alone. We need to have the close protection and we should be also authorized for some specific reason. Then I would like to have some feedback on my question, why they should change this business.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Romano, and I'm sure the other panelists and the audience will be happy to further elaborate on this.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving
الجواب كان وافيا.
Important to mention that mixed migration also involves refugees and asylum seekers in addition to migrants. And of course, refugees are people to whom protection is owed. And while a part of these flows are looking for a better life, in some other cases, it's much more than that. But that's of course.
Let me add the last things about these migrants. What we are usually speaking is the poor migrants routes, because there is also the VIP, the one that are richer. They will set up their own smuggling, and they will choose when, how. They will drive. They will be brought with the vehicle with the AC or with very fast boat. It's a totally different route and vehicle way of being smuggled. Even there, see.
No, absolutely, and what you said just reinforced our comment. And thank you, of course, for pointing out how important is interagency coordination, not only
تنسيق بين الوكالات ليس فقط
in the same countries. We have seen that a lot of times different institutions working on apparently different forms of crime are investigating and prosecuting the same people. So once again, thank you very much. I would like now to introduce our last speaker, but of course not least, Ms. Federica Lachioma. Ms. Lachioma is a specialized deputy prosecutor at the Office of the Prosecutor of Palermo since 2018 for bankruptcy and fiscal crimes, and since 2015 for sexual abuse, domestic violence, human trafficking, and smuggling of migrants. She's also deputy prosecutor for mafia cases in Palermo and Agrigento, and she's a member of the smuggling of migrants and human trafficking specialized group, and a member of the European Investigation Order specialized group. Ms. Lachioma, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Filippo, for inviting me to this meeting, and I'm happy to cooperate again with the Institute, which has been
معي سروري أن أعمل مرة أخرى مع المعهد والذي كان مصدر لي.
And what I would like to highlight since the very beginning of my contribution to this session is that when we are working as prosecutors in case of smuggling of migrants and human trafficking, we are coping with a very high paradox, that is that we have so much source of information, so many sources of evidence, but at the same time it is so difficult to gather them because of the international limits to the activity of gathering information. If you consider that smuggling of migrants and human traffickings generate a huge amount of
البشر يؤدي
all of the victims of human trafficking and smuggling of migrants, it's such a huge source of witnesses that who could give us important information in terms of the source of the crime. And at the same time, we can see from our computers through the open web sources like Facebook or other social networks that we have a huge and transnational flow of information regarding the perpetrators of the crime. So paradoxically, we are dealing with very complex crime to investigate, but at the same time, we are surrounded by so many forms of potential evidence. The problem is that it's difficult for us to transform this potential evidence into real evidence that we can use in our trials. And to this point, it's very important to cooperate with the other countries in order to gather all what we have as potential evidence. But at the same time, when we are dealing with evidence, we are dealing with human lives. So it's important to keep in mind an inquiry mindset, that is to arrest the perpetrators of the crime, but at the same time to grant the safety of the witnesses and to give them the chance to access to the instruments that our systems provide them. For example, example, visas if they cooperate with us. So when we are working as a prosecutors in cases regarding smuggling of migrants and human trafficking, we have to have a comprehensive approach that is, on one side, an investigative one to transform, as I said, potential evidence into real evidence capable of being used in the trials, but at the same time we have to keep in mind the protective mindsets that we have to bear in mind when we are dealing with human people that are involved in such a huge crime and transnational crimes. And also we have to keep in mind that sometimes those who have been victims are involved in the crimes at such a point that they start to cooperate with the perpetrators of the crime himself or herself. We have not evidence so far, at least in the jurisdiction which I have, that there is the connection between human trafficking and smuggling of migrants with the terrorism, but we have evidence that human smuggling and trafficking in persons is strongly connected with the smuggling of cigarettes and tobaccos. And sometimes the same people, the same victims of human trafficking, are forced to work for, pay their debits to the criminal organization to work in the smuggling of cigarettes. And so we can hail with great enthusiasm the decision of the European Union to create a proper investigative body, which is the European Public Prosecutor Office, which cooperates with us in tackling the huge issue of smuggling of tobaccos. Of course, smuggling of tobacco is not an offensive crime as human smuggling and trafficking of migrants, but at the same time is capable of creating a huge amount of financial assets that are the same assets that can be used by the criminal organization to reinforce their structure, for example, by buying new instruments for granting the travel between Africa and Italy. And we have to consider that the smuggling of tobacco is an important, connected with human trafficking because the traffickers can use the victim themselves as people to recruit for granting the smuggling of tobacco. So we cannot forget the importance of smuggling of tobaccos and cigarettes. We're dealing with the human trafficking because they are connected, also because the victims of human trafficking are often used as a smuggler themselves for tobacco to repay the debt. So it's important to have an integrated approach, and to this extent the importance of creating the European Public Prosecutor Office is to be stressed, because it is an important tool for us to have a wide approach to the phenomenon, because in the European Prosecutor Office, the EPPO, we can have a view of the phenomenon in regions of Italy that are bigger than the strict region that we consider as the source of our jurisdiction. For example, 2 members have been appointed in southern Italy that follow all the investigations, all the inquiries in terms of smuggling of tobaccos, not only in Sicily but also in Calabria and in other southern regions. So Italy has been, for example, completely divided into macro areas, and this is important because it gives us a broader approach that on one side is very geographically located in part of Italy, like north, center and south, but on the other side it is also connected with Europe, because it's important that we consider that all these crimes of smuggling of migrants, human trafficking and smuggling of tobacco and cigarettes are connected at the larger point, and it's important to understand the flows from a wider point of view, that is the European ones. So I think that also the institution of and the effective functioning of the European Public Prosecutor Office is an evidence, it's a symptom of the global approach that we are trying to stress, and that we have been trying to stress for many years.
المقاربة الشاملة والواسعة
Forms of judicial assistance from other countries. I need to say that from the experience of the cases in smuggling of migrants and human trafficking that we have been dealing so far. For example, I think to the Glauco operation or to the Scorpion Fish operation that were both conducted by my office and that have been completely been successfully completed so far. We have experimented a successful cooperation with the other countries, the other European countries that have been ready to give us judicial assistance. And I need to say that lately we have tried to trigger some other forms of judicial assistance with countries that have not been traditionally involved in this kind of judicial assistance so far. But at a certain level, I think that also these experiments have been successful because we have been able to have assistance also from African countries, especially very crucial African countries like, for example, Libya and or for example from the Emirates. And to this extent, since I know that as a prosecutor, my
كمدعية عامة مساهمة
juridical and theoretical. I would like to, I have selected so far some examples of rogatory letters that we have sent so far to these countries in order to show you how in our office we try to broaden the list of evidence that we have so far in order to complete the list of evidence that we can gain through the investigation in our countries. And I have selected so far, in particular, three examples of forms of judicial assistance that we have experienced so far with Libya, with the Emirates, and with the Eurojust. The first case with Libya was made within the inquiry that is commonly named as Glauco. Glauco, for those who don't know it, was an important inquiry made by our office that actually turned into an investigation in smuggling of migrants and human trafficking, but started as an investigation on the crime of illicit use of banking system. Sometimes it's very difficult because of the fear of the victims to investigate directly and straightforward in terms of human trafficking. So sometimes it's easier to start from a side point of view, for example, by stressing the financial aspect of the phenomenon. And to this point, the crime of illicit use of credit, illicit exercise of credit, it's a shortcut for us as investigators, because this organization that organized the travel from Africa to Asia to Europe, or from Asia to Europe, are paid by the Avala system. As you know, the Avala system is a form of credit based on the trust that is typical of the Horn of Africa, and actually
بشكل كبير في
of the travel by the Avala system are illicitly exercising the credit. So they are working as banks, even if they are not entitled as bankers. So this is a crime in Italy, and it's easier to gather evidence on the use of illicit credit and banking system than expecting for a frightened witness of human trafficking to speak up against the perpetrators of the crime. So we started our investigation with the system as an investigation against the illicit exercise of banking system. And we started this important Glauco case that was mainly based upon the outcome of the wiretapping system. As you know, wiretapping is, in Italy, we made a large use of wiretapping that are a very invasive form, massive form of investigation, but actually it has been very useful. And I need to say that it has been more effective since we now can resort to the European investigation order to gather the results of the wiretapping wiretappings even from other European countries. We have been issuing state of European investigation order, or we have been addressees of European investigation order through which we have requested to other countries, other European countries, or we have been requested by other European countries to wiretap people that are steadily living in our countries, in the European countries where the European investigation order is sent, in order to wiretap people to gather evidence of the crime. And I need to say that the institution of the European investigation order has been a result very useful for the investigation, because before the existence of the European investigation order, we were required to ask for a rogatory letter in order to have a wiretappings, while now the rogatory letter passed through the power of the political authorities, while now with the European investigation order we can straightforward ask to our correspondents, who is another prosecutor in another European country, to wiretap the suspected persons. And through the wiretappings, both in the Clauso case and in the Scorpion Fish case, which is another case that I will illustrate a bit further on, we gather a lot of evidence against some suspected people who were located in Libya. So what we decided as a prosecutor office was to send a rogatory letter according to an important legal instruments, which is the Judicial Cooperation and Assistance Treaty that has been signed between Italy and Libya in according with the United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime and its supplementary protocols that have been ratified both by Italy and Libya, because it regarded one of the crimes listed in the agreement. And it was consistent with the memorandum of understanding that has been recently signed between the Italian anti-mafia and anti-terrorism directorate and the chief public prosecutor of Tripoli. So our rogatory letter has been preceded by important legal and instruments and political pressure that provide us the chance to ask for a rogatory letter straightforward to Libya, because we had evidence that in some parts of Libya, some armed group had created a real militia, which is an armed force parallel to the national one, and they were practically kidnapping people, forcing them to pay a huge amount of money to send them to Italy, and they were able to collect the payment for them.
وكان بإمكانهم
was to give us judicial assistance and so to grant investigative support in order to identify the people using the numbers that we were able to extract from the wiretappings that we were making in Italy, to identify them and to identify the numbers in order to maybe possibly wiretap them too, in order to reconstruct all the members of the militia and all the members of the armed group. So it's important to try to make a strong pressure on the country of Africa in order to help us to have the judicial assistance that is necessary, because otherwise our judicial investigation need to stop to a national level, which actually is a limited one because we are dealing with transnational crimes, and the transnational dimension is not only limited to the country where the victims arrive or the country where the perpetrators of the crime are located, for example in this case Italy and Libya, but most of the time the countries involved in the transnational crimes are countries that are far away, but are those countries where the assets that are the outcome of this kind of
عن هذه الجرائم البشعة. وبهذا أشير إلى
derogatory letters that I wanted to show you. That is the derogatory letter that we sent to the Emirates. And in this case too, we were dealing with the case where we were investigating in the case of smuggling of migrants through the Avala system, and tracking the route of the money, we had the evidence, which was a documentary evidence, that the money arrived from Italy, where they were kept as the payment of the debt of the victims. They were sent through Europe. They were sent until the Emirates, where the perpetrators of the crime established some companies that were used as money laundering centers that were used to launder the money that they were having from the victims of the crime, to try to transform them into clean money that could be used for other forms of investment in companies that were dealing completely different products, for example, sanitary products. And so what we had
تعمل في مجال مواد التنظيف مثلا. ما وجد
arrived from Africa, transit through Italy, and finally landed in the Emirates. So what we tried to do was to investigate the end of the money, the complex process of laundering the money, and to this extent we needed to ask the assistant, the judicial assistance of the United Emirates and United Arabic Emirates, and this judicial request of judicial assistance was, as the one as I mentioned before, based on the same judicial United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, to which and its protocols, to which both Italy and the Emirates were party, because we were dealing with one of the crime listed in the convention, because we were dealing with a transnational crime, that is a crime committed between armed groups and settled in through different countries. And in this case it was important because the aspect, as I said before, of human interests against the heinous crime like human trafficking mixed with the financial interest in ascertain where the money were kept and how were transformed. And it is important because it was the perfect confirmation of on the decision that we made when we established our team of investigators. As I said many times in my presentation in the institute, when we started with this new challenge of fighting against the human trafficking in the Palermo Prosecution Office, we decided to make a team composed of both criminal prosecutor having an experience in mafia cases, or as in my case in financial crimes, both with prosecutor experience in case, and trained in case of sexual abuse and domestic violence, because we need to take into account that when we are dealing with the smuggling of migrants, we are on, as I said before, on one side, they need to take care of the victims who are the most important source of our information, and are people who travel throughout these routes in the sea or in Africa or in Asia, and they are victims of human crimes. They are violated in their physical integrity, in psychological integrity. So on one side, we have to be careful to deal with them because we are dealing with people who are violated in their human rights. But on the other hand, we need to take into account that we are dealing with important and dangerous criminal association, very well structured as in mafia cases, that are able to work and cooperate throughout different countries with other transnational groups, often armed groups. So we have to have an integrated approach, both protective on one side, but on the other side, very careful on the use of all the judicial instruments that we have at our disposal. Also because it's important to us to consider how the
من الضروري بالنسبة لنا
of migrants change into times, and also because of the intervention of the states. As I said probably before, when I started my experience in this team of investigators, we were dealing mainly with a huge amount of people coming from Africa in big boats that mostly wrecked all of the time, where now we are dealing with a much more sophisticated trip that are in charge of small organizations that are more interested in ensuring the trip to Italy, for example, not to big mass of people, but to some selected passengers who are mainly passengers that have the criminal career in their own country. They are at their disposal huge amount of money that can grant the trip to Italy in a safe way. So the form of the phenomenon has changed because of the political and the judicial experience that we have enacted to fight against it. So it's important not only to respond by an investigative approach, but also to study the phenomenon. That is what we try to do with a group of integrated prosecutors who take care of all the evolution on the phenomenon and not only to the single solution of the case. And to this extent, it's important to cooperate always with the other colleagues from other countries and also with the other institutions, as I said before, the EPPO, European Public Prosecutor Office, and also with the Eurojust. The third and last form of rogatory that I wanted to share with you was the rogatory letters that we sent to the Italian member of the Eurojust, according to the law establishing Eurojustice, the directive establishing Eurojustice, and that is in charge of transnational crime, and we can resort to Eurojust when we are dealing with an investigation regarding more than one country. So we are dealing with a transnational crime, that is a crime regarding an associated group operating in more countries.
مجموعة تعمل في أكثر من بلد، ولكن عندما
because we need to grant evidence not only from one country, for example, in the case I said before, Libya or the Emirates, but from more countries, because, for example, the perpetrators are located steadily in Libya, but the money was sent to Emirates, but at the same time, some of the perpetrators sent their money to Germany, or they they moved to Sweden, or some of them were sent in other countries in Europe. We have to face with the transnational investigation other than a transnational crime. So it's impossible to coordinate all the activities through different countries, because, as I often said, we are dealing with crimes that need to be perpetrated, to be repressed very fast, because we are dealing with flows of humans that are rapidly moving throughout the different countries. So in order to grant a fast investigation, we can ask assistance to Eurojust, because the Italian member, in our case of Eurojust, can activate and trigger Eurojust in order to trigger all the members of this integrated institution, so we can grant investigation at the same pace with different countries in order to have a complete outcome in the same time. And in this case, we were dealing, exactly as I said, with the crime that was committed between Sudan and Italy, but we had evidence that the money that was sent in this case too through Havala involved people that were located both in Switzerland and in Germany and in Sweden. In this case, we triggered the Italian member of Eurojust in order to ask judicial assistance to the members of the mentioned countries in order to have a unique outcome. That is exactly what happened. So in the end, and to conclude, as I said, when we are dealing with these kind of crimes, we are surrounded by a huge amount of sources, also open sources, but we need to be wise enough to transform them into effective evidence that can be used into trial. In order to do it, we need to not to be selfish, but we have to ask assistance to other countries and to other institutions. So it's essential to have always an integrated approach. As I said before, not only a geographical integrated approach, but also an integrated approach in terms of protection of victims on one side, but also attention to the political outcome of the flows and of the investigation, and at the same time our proper mission as investigator in order to prosecute crime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lakioma, for your presentation, for making clear the importance
على عرضك وعلى تسليط الضوء على اختيار
perspective. I mean, you showed us the complexity that's behind such kind of investigations and prosecutions, and the crucial need of a further coordination among different stakeholders, and also the efforts that have been made in the past years towards a global approach in seeking judicial cooperation. So thank you once again. We have a number of questions from the floor. And of course, I'm happy to remember to the other speakers that had comments that they are free to take the floor also. We have two questions I would like to begin with. And if to some extent all the speakers touched upon these questions, I think it would be a good opportunity to further elaborate. So the first question is from Mr. Gondal, and it's a question related to the overall criminal justice systems, investigation, prosecutions, and trials, which in some cases may have weaker systems and responses when it comes to dealing with illicit flows and organized crime. So this, I would like the speakers of the second session, but of course, Ms. Silveira is also more welcomed than, she's welcome to participate. And the second question is a question that probably would keep us speaking for the next 3 or 4 days. It's the level of control of sovereign states in a globalized world. The question is, are sovereign states in the position to adapt themselves as quickly as the smuggling flows are in the framework of a globalized world? So I reopen the floor to the speakers and to just further elaborate on these two issues.
I would like to take advantage of this second question in order to introduce an issue that we have been discussed in our office. Sovereignty, because it looks as a topic of the past. We are used to study the sovereignty in the constitutional course of our study, academic study, but it's a very modern issue, and we are facing it nowadays with the institution of EPPO, the European Public Prosecutor Office, because the EPPO is competent according to the law enacting the directive, the regulation. EPPO is competent for smuggling of tobaccos and cigarettes, but as you know, the tobacco and cigarettes are subjected to 2 forms of taxes. One is a European Union tax, and the other one is a national tax that we have in Italy, and it's very high. And the level of the Italian tax is higher than the European one. So we have discussed very much at the level of the courts of cassation the competence of the European Public Prosecutor Office, because we have in this case 2 victims. One is the European Union and the other is the Italian state, but the General Prosecutor of the Court of Cassation
المشكلة بهذه المسائل قد أشار إلى أن
recognized to the European Public Prosecutor Office, because even though the economic level of taxation violated is higher with regard to Italy than with regard to the European Union, nevertheless the approach to be taken into account during the investigation needs to be an integrated approach, so a European approach. So in this case, the sovereignty that has been classically considered in terms of importance, economic importance, has been in a way neglected in favor of the notion of sovereignty in terms of capacity, as I said before, to conduct an investigation that can take into account a global consideration of the phenomenon. So I think that in this case is very clear and is pivotal, because it allows us to understand as how the sovereignty, which is a classical concept in the constitutional law that has been considered especially in terms of economic power, has now turned into a notion of sovereignty regarding the capacity of taking into account a global approach in the comprehension of the phenomenon. So I think we are now facing an important turning point into the notion of sovereignty while prosecuting the crimes. And I think it's very in line with the change of the time, what we have faced so far in the investigation dealing with the smuggling of migrants, of people on goods in the Mediterranean. So I think that this case regarding the pronouncement of the General Prosecutor of the Court of Cassation is a clear example of how the notion of sovereignty has changed so far.
Thank you very much for this comment, Ms. Lachioma. I was wondering if Ms. Silveira and Mr. Romano wanted to, and of course, Dr. Aziani, feel free to, if wanted further comment on the two questions. So on the first question is on a possible overall reform, although it's a very, again, we could speak about this for the next couple of months, on the overall criminal justice reform at the national level, or on the adaptability of national institutions in a globalized world.
Well, I can just make a brief comment. We know that all that was said also by Mr. Andrea Romano is true, is the adaptability of the criminal world, and that the law enforcement and the justice systems are always behind the criminals. One focus that I think it's very relevant, regardless of the systems that take just the institutions, the legislation, the legal frameworks, the cooperation and the exchange of information in our perspective is the most crucial topic that we should advance on in order to most effectively counter the criminal action. Even taking a long time to make reforms, to adjust and adapt the criminal and the justice systems, if the institutions engaged in more direct and operational cooperation, and there are mechanisms to do so, that could maybe help to advance in terms of countering the criminal action, and that in our perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Silveira. Something I think I would like also to share from the perspective of the Institute is that we believe, and I think that this is of course also in line with all the comments of our speakers, that cultivating cross-sectorial perspective may be the antidote to what we see as a fragmented and siloed approach to illicit flows and organized crime. So the need of seeing as much as possible the overall, the big picture, identifying the central challenges in the criminal justice response.
إن كانت متضافرة تمكن من الفهم
in the development of new, stronger policies to make the adjustments that will have the most impact across boards. And at the same time, this also offers a greater promise for a stronger interagency cooperation and collaboration, as well as a closer cooperation between private and public sectors in the Mediterranean, but also beyond. I don't see other questions from the floor, but I see that Mr. Romano would like to comment. Further comments, please. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. It's just in order to enhance
الإعلان عن تنظيم هذا التعاون في مجال
will rise up their skills in the forensic and chain of custody, because all evidences, the most of the evidences, once they are collected, if they are not collected in the proper way, cannot be used later on. Even if you establish a future cooperation, international legal assistance, or any other kind of cooperation, MOU, is not possible to use because they are not legal. And then at least that part should be raised up by the international cooperation and law enforcement. Here in Libya, we are already setting up, and we already did some training on this topic, but it should be done all over the North Africa and neighboring countries, so that at least they will have the same standard that we need to have. Otherwise, we cannot use that as evidences. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Romano, to reinforce and to re-underline what Ms. Lachioma mentioned in the presentation. I mean, it was very good to have different perspectives from different actors working most of the times on similar cases, but again, from a different perspective. And it's positive to see that we're all aiming towards the same direction. As I said, I don't see any other questions, and we are incredibly almost on time. So I would like to leave the floor to Dr. Aziani from Transcrime, and then I will make some closing remarks.
Thank you, Director Musca. To conclude, I want just to thank all the panelists for their very relevant intervention and for the animated discussion they give us the opportunity to have. Thanks a lot for answering Siracusa International Institute and take part in a forum to our project. Second, I want to thank Director Musca and the Siracusa International Institute for hosting this very interesting event. We dreamed, as I said, to be in Siracusa, but I'm sure we will have other opportunity in the future to meet all there. And I want also to thank the audience for their participation and for their very punctual questions and comments. Sometimes the needs for coordination and network of individual institutions to deal with a particularly complex phenomena sounds like a sort of cliche, something that we always say. I think it has not been the case in the development of this project. That would have not been possible without the indication, the contribution of a very vast and differentiated audience of stakeholders and experts to take part to the project. And I agree with Dr. Musca, it will not be it would be fundamental, this coordination and this network, this multilateralism in this will be fundamental also to find actual solution to the issues we have been discussing today. Thank you again for your attention and for taking part to this event.
Thank you, Alberto. We call ourselves by name, and but being Italian, we always get very, very formal. So you made my job easier in closing this webinar. You already thanked our fantastic speakers. I would also like to thank the institutions that are behind the speakers, so Europol and UBAM and the Office of the Prosecutor of Palermo. But again, thank to each one of you for having taken the time to be with us today and sharing your experience with our audience. I would also like to thank the interpreters for having done a fantastic job in translating, starting from myself, 6 very fast speakers. We know it's always quite difficult, but from the comments I read, it was a fantastic translation. Of course, we need to thank who made financially possible the event. The project was funded within the framework of a PMI Impact Initiative. And I would like to thank the staff of the Institute for the support to this webinar. And last, but of course not least, I would like to thank the most important component, or since I'm Italian, I would say the most important part of this recipe, because without an audience, this webinar would have just been a small gathering of experts. Thank for all those that have registered to the event, that have participated actively and making questions. We hope, and I speak on behalf of the Institute, but also of all the partners, that this meeting has been fruitful and informative. And in thanking again all partners involved, I wish you a fantastic rest of the day. Thank you very much, and goodbye.